chasing a feeling.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feels Out Loud, brought to you by Becoming Together Therapy and Wellness. This is your host, Tara Martini, along with Becky McNattin. We are glad to have you listening as we live and share stories of mental health.
I have really been looking forward to the show today.
Me too, girl.
Because you and I, we learn so much every week from all of the shows, but we learn a ton from our panel discussions. And today we are here to process through really it's a very complex topic of trauma. So glad to have our guests, Amanda Sullivan and Amy Gold, here, along with you and I, Tara, to explore all of this together. And each of us here today has different training in working with trauma, which is why I'm so excited to hear these different perspectives and opinions. And I want to give that brief caveat as we start to our listeners that we will be talking about trauma today. And as you listen, this may bring some things up for you. So please be kind to yourself in what you feel or experience and take care of those needs as they arise. And welcome, Amy and Amanda. Appreciate you two joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So I wanted to put out there, 70% of adults worldwide experience some type of trauma in their lifetime. 70%. That kind of feels like it's part of the human experience. And 3.6% of adults in the U.S. have experienced symptoms of PTSD in just the last year. And in the U.S., 8% of women and 4% of men will experience PTSD in their lifetime. So there is this significant amount of traumatic experience all around us, likely daily, and absolutely impacts our mental wellness. And I wanted to just get vibes or thoughts about those statistics from everyone.
I think what you said about it does seem that trauma is a universal experience. I was shocked, and I don't know if it's because we live in the therapeutic realm, but I was surprised because my guess would be that more people would have PTSD symptoms. I was surprised, and sadly, I would think the statistic would be higher regarding men and women and their experience with symptoms of PTSD. What, ladies?
Yeah. What are thoughts from
did you
Amy?
think when you heard that?
Yeah, and even just statistically, the changes over the years, right? Like right now, I think we identify trauma so much more, right? And we define it for people. I was thinking, like, folks might not realize that bullying is trauma. It can be a chronic, prolonged trauma. And social media, and that it's out there, talking about it more. So I think we're identifying trauma, which is great. I mean, to be identifying and the awareness out there around it. And I think lately, too, just even exposure socially, how we're on TV, the things we see compared to back in the day, and those kind of things are different, too. So I wonder how much that changes just stats.
Yeah. What about you, Amanda?
I think those are such great points that everyone has made. I agree. I think, if we look globally, there are lots of cultures where, unfortunately, things like war, genocide, famine, food insecurity are happening constantly, and those things are all traumatic. So the number of 70% didn't seem high to me. And I think if we think about the last, 5 years and the COVID pandemic and how the collective kind of trauma of the isolation that caused and illness and death and all of the different ways in which maybe that impacted us, that 70% doesn't seem, I think, all that high. I was also surprised, Tara, and I thought about for myself, like, do I have a skewed view because I am a therapist, the trauma therapist?
That's hard.
And people diagnosed with PTSD, and how many people actually have symptoms that are never reported or diagnosed? And so I think that the statistic is probably likely higher of people who would potentially meet criteria for PTSD. And I think...
Well,
here comes the music.
Here comes the music. It's such an important topic here, and we have tons to cover. Right now, we're going to take a short commercial break, but stay tuned as we further explore the concept of trauma in mental health. Thanks so much for listening to Feels Out Loud. We will be back in just a moment.
You don't never need help from nobody else. All you got to do now. In a world full of strangers, you don't know to trust. All you see is danger, trying to find what you
Welcome back to Feels Out Loud, brought to you by Becoming Together Therapy and Wellness. I am Tara Martini with Becky McNattin and two lovely guests today. Let's dive right back into our discussion on trauma.
I would love to hear from each of you, because all three of you, everybody here is a therapist that works with trauma. What makes you passionate about being a clinician who helps process trauma? Amy, would you start?
Yeah. I've been doing this a long time, over 20 years, and I would say it's just really seeing people when they come and they're so stuck in their trauma. And, they're stuck in flashbacks, images they're having, they're not sleeping, the anxiety, depression is so high.
Yeah.
And just knowing that the work that we can do through our therapeutic treatments for trauma, we'll be talking about that another show, but that how you can just really help them get unstuck, and you see that change and that relief of their symptoms. So, just really seeing results is just motivation to be like, if people are out there, come in and get some help, because this can be a better life.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What about you, Amanda?
I think a lot of my reasons are similar to Amy. Prior to becoming a therapist, I worked in different settings as a social worker with a lot of people who were struggling with different areas of their life, whether they were behavioral or functioning or with their relationships, and kind of seeing how trauma had impacted them from even early on in their life as children and continued to stay with them really motivated me to become a therapist, but also a therapist who had training in these trauma interventions to, like Amy said, help people get out of this cycle where they feel stuck, to feel safer in their bodies, to feel safer in the world, but also improve their relationships with themselves and with others.
Well said.
I think for me, it was kind of unique in that it wasn't my experience with clients or students that motivated me. It was the idea of I was still a student in grad school, and obviously as you're learning, and my past as a school counselor, obviously in the world we have trauma, but I was introduced to brain spotting, a modality to work with people who had experienced trauma. And for the first time, to be given a concrete answer or assistance to people with trauma, and to be trained in something like that, and went, wait, there's something I could be trained in to actually help people to develop those coping skills, to assist them on their journey of healing, was so profound for me. And it was like, wait,
wow.
I want to do this. And then that's where my passion came from. And then that's when I started working, once I finished school. That's what sparked my interest and passion.
I love that. So how would you all define trauma and how you see this impacting the body? It's a big question.
It is a big question. Well, kind of where I start with is that trauma, we kind of have these universal events as therapists that we kind of define as, could potentially be traumatic, which I think we'll talk about some of those and the types of trauma. But really, also, I think it has to do with how does the person experience that event? Do they define it as being traumatic in the context of their life? And I say that to clients a lot. Like, therapists might call this thing that you're telling me about a trauma. Do you define it that way? And a lot of how we work with trauma and define trauma as clinicians does have to do with an event that kind of supersedes our normal resiliency or capacity as human beings and might cause emotional or physiological issues in our body or in our relationships. That's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah. And I would say, adding to that, it's causing some type of distress, whether it's physical, emotional, mental, in that, like Amanda said, it is fascinating how humans define it differently, in that I'll have a client who will, will ask, whether it's during an assessment or in conversation during a session, and we'll use that word trauma, and they're like, no, never had any kind of traumatic experience. And then they'll go on to describe something, and I'll be thinking to myself, wow, I would definitely and I'm not saying that out loud, but I was like, wow, our definition of traumatic is very different. So it is learning, like, how does the client define traumatic? But I definitely think it is that is there a moment or an event or something that occurred where that person did not have the ability to process or cope?
I was thinking that, thinking about you and your work with kids too, Tara, and working myself with kids in the past, that child neglect sometimes folks, they'll talk their stories around their childhood, and sure, if there was physical abuse, okay, that was traumatic, but neglect and chronic just not having somebody there taking care of them, but not considering that trauma.
Well, because that is the absence of something.
Yeah.
Right? And for many, if you think of trauma, it's usually the presence of something.
Yes.
The presence of physical harm.
Good point.
The presence of violence,
A
where
significant
neglect
event.
is the absence of care.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I see trauma as, I agree with all of these definitions. My thought is it's a moment of framework shifting. A moment where your perspective on this world, the things that you believe to be true, are challenged, or you're faced with that recognition, and I call them paradigm shifters. Like, you are fundamentally changed. And because I'm a metaphor person, I think about, like, if life is about integration, and you're weaving the Afghan of you, and someone hands you a rock and says, integrate that, and you're like, well, I've only used yarn. It's that kind of paradigm shift, that everything you thought you were doing, trauma is a moment where you say, how do I reckon with this? And in terms of how it impacts the body, well, our body doesn't know how to respond to it because it fundamentally has shifted the way we see the world.
Beautifully put.
Yeah. That's
And then just taking on that, when it is something like childhood neglect, say, where it's all you know.
Yeah.
Right.
So your baseline is the trauma,
Right.
the chronic just, and then having to identify that later in life, It's
Right.
like, that's all I knew.
Yes.
that was my norm.
That was the norm.
Yep.
Yeah.
And you don't know until someone tells you that's not the norm. Right? Until someone says, well, honey, that's not the way someone shows love. Or
And do that help them integrate
Yeah.
trauma,
Yes.
paradigm shift in that.
Right.
Right. And I was going to say to Becky's point, how those events that shift your paradigm, then what I say is get stuck in our nervous system. So
Yeah.
Yes.
our nervous system starts to respond differently to things that are both internal and external. And our emotions and our physiological responses are maybe different than they were before that thing happened.
And we have to figure out how to hold that. Both how to get it unstuck, because you talk about it being stuck in our nervous system. We talked about that on the show too.
Yes.
Yeah.
How do we even notice that that's occurring?
Right.
Because that's part of trauma, in even learning to live a certain way, that is normalized for us.
Yep.
And so recognize what's occurring, and then figure out ways to process that so it isn't stuck in our bodies.
I was thinking with like being hypervigilant. So if you're in a childhood, going back to childhood again, but and there's violence going around and domestic violence, and you grow up being very hypervigilant and always aware of your surroundings. You walk in any room and that's how you feel. You're looking. But if that's your norm, and then coming in and going, now, how do I, first it's awareness, identify, but then what does it feel like when that starts getting distressed? I mean, going less.
well, yes, and those are the children who you see at a young age who don't know how to behave in calm. They know how to behave when
Yes.
there's chaos in a classroom. They're the ones who are picking the fights or hitting or screaming, and no one can figure out why. Well, it's because that's when they're comfortable.
Yes.
They don't know what to do in the calm when everyone's getting along.
That's the scary part for them. Yeah.
Amanda, you had looked like you wanted to say something. Was something on your mind? No, she was
don't know.
okay. Well, going
I
off
was
that.
just, thinking, I was digesting what they were saying.
Okay,
Yeah.
Amy, you bring up childhood, and you've talked about it a couple times. I want to have a follow-up. I want to ask you a follow-up question to that. So, 60% of adults report experiencing adverse childhood experiences. In the therapeutic world, we call them ACEs, but adverse childhood experiences. And in the U.S., about 26% of children experience trauma before the age of 4. So 1/4 of children, and it very well could be higher than this because
right.
like we've all just talked about, what's normalized, what is seen as typical for someone as they're growing up, they might not even see as trauma. So you talk about what you see as impacting. I'd love to hear more from everybody on your views about how this impacts mental health. How these early childhood or adverse childhood experiences, which could happen after the age of 4 too.
Yeah. I mean, I think of attachment a lot then, and developmental delays is in there. I think if you're exposed so much to trauma before the age of 4, that can carry with you about all interpersonal relationships and that not being able to trust others, and that's how I see it kind of play out in some areas.
Right.
Well, and with young children experiencing those things early in life, I love to talk about how the brain and the nervous system work. So what we actually know is that people who are experiencing this type of trauma in childhood is it actually affects the development of their amygdala, and they have an overactive amygdala, which increases anxiety and a sense of fear, which can lead to PTSD symptoms, generalized anxiety disorder. We also know that it can affect the other parts of the brain, like the hippocampus, which affects how we internalize memories. And then, I hear parents say a lot, or adults say, well, if my kid doesn't remember it, like it won't affect them. And that's actually not true, unfortunately. Our bodies store so much of what our brain cognitively doesn't. And so our nervous system starts to respond to external kinds of cues or triggers. Like if I know that, someone slamming the door means that they're angry in my home, then my nervous system is going to start associating those things with each other. And even into adulthood, it might kind of be an activator for you when people slam doors, even if it's not intentional or because they're angry.
Very good point.
That trauma triggers,
Yeah.
And so you bring up something, Amanda, on can we process trauma we don't remember? And we hear that a lot as clinicians. I don't know. Did something happen before I had a working memory? Or was it a part of my daily lived experience that I don't have access to?
Right.
And I hear you saying, well, yes, we absolutely can, because there's more to what memory is than our conscious memory.
Yes.
Would you say more about that?
Yeah, we learn to associate different things in our life with emotions, sensations, smells, sensory experiences. We develop these kind of somatic reactions to things. So again, like let's say that you grew up in a house or just like, let's talk about a positive association. Let's say you grew up in a house where you knew that if mom was cooking spaghetti, that was going to be like a good dinner. Like everyone loves spaghetti. It usually was a good vibe. When you smell someone cooking spaghetti, you're going to have positive memories of that, right? Your body is going to have this reaction that feels very fond for you. But the same thing also works in the reverse. So if there is some sort of negative stimulus, your body is also going to respond to that and hold and store all of this. And you might not know what the association is necessarily, because if you didn't again, have those cognitive memories, your nervous system might still respond to that smell or that sound or that tone of someone's voice.
Yep.
Yeah, what would you say, Tara?
100% I agree with that. And it even carries over to, when I was an English teacher, I would teach my kids about the 5 senses and about how we would spend days talking about that, about how many people talk about a smell you associate with a person, a moment, a location, a sound, all of those things. And it's that the component of you don't have to have that exact memory necessarily. It can be, when you relate it to trauma, a trigger. If you take it, like you said, it can be a positive of that spaghetti dinner. It could be a negative. You hear the sound of a car horn, could be for a car accident. So many different things. And it's that component of you don't have to remember. I always say, like when you had said, can trauma be there even if you don't remember? But your body remembers.
The body holds
The
the
body
Body holds
holds
the
that.
story, yeah.
Yes. Your body holds the story.
Yeah, what would you say, Amy?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think about, even like with clients where seasons can be, especially with the heavy grief or loss, and so fall is that time, or spring, or just smells of the seasons can trigger, and so it's not so in their face, but they know there's something off here, and then you can go back to, that was that time period.
Yeah,
Right.
one thing that that concept makes me think about is, can we process trauma we don't remember? Maybe what we need to think about with that question is the word process. I was stuck on the word process, that so often I think us humans get in this mindset that process equals verbal. And that particularly therapy would be, well, if I can't remember it, I can't process it, because memory has this sense of cognition attached to it. When really processing, I think everybody in this room has huge bias around processing, could be sitting in water, or as you do all the time, Amanda, yoga, some sort of physicality. And at Becoming Together, we do lots of artistic expression. That processing doesn't have to be words attached to things. But I think when we think about memory, we think about verbal recollection of it. And so for our listeners who are sitting there saying, well, can I process trauma? Well, everybody in this room is saying, yes, you can, from that sensory place. And also because there are hundreds of ways to process.
There are.
That we can, that allow our body access to, hold, acknowledge, work through things that aren't just verbal sharing.
Oh, to share a personal story, and Amanda actually was teaching the yoga class. My first experience with yoga as someone that was going through something, I was taking her class, and it was outside on the rooftop. And I was doing a real good job for like 10 minutes. And then all of a sudden, it was just this flood of emotions. I was just overcome.
Yeah.
And I was processing what I was going through. She was just leading a yoga session. Not
right.
like trauma or anything.
Right.
Like she's just talking about like breathing.
Not telling you to go there.
Comforting things.
Yeah.
And, like I think it was even on just in, like empowerment and womanhood. And I'm sitting here processing it, and it was the most healing thing, and there was no talking done by me. And I just sat there processing, and it was the most healing experience and supportive environment. And I finished, and I was like, that was the most cleansing, healing thing ever. My point is, you can heal and process things in moments that are very unexpected. But why in that moment? Because I felt safe, and I felt supported. And I felt calm. So my body was just like, hey, let's do some healing right now.
Yeah, and you literally did release something.
Yeah.
Yes.
And to listeners who are tuning in today, please hear me when I say that on this processing trauma we don't remember. Sometimes trauma literally causes us to not remember. The experience of trauma, and I want to get into that for what you all would say about that. But if you have experienced something, our bodies have this incredible response system that can actually cause us to not remember. So sometimes that is also what is at play. It didn't only happen before we had an ability to cognate that we were too young. It actually is the process of trauma.
Yes.
Well, it's us protecting. Yes, it is.
Yeah, and so what would you all say about how trauma affects memory and even how we perceive events? Amy,
Well,
you share.
It is a common thing I see with clients coming in, that before we even get to that there's a trauma or we're going to work on trauma stuff, it's, the comment of, I don't remember between age 5 and 10, but I remember things, like there'll be like this gap in memory of childhood. And then that is that time period of pretty significant trauma. Later on, you're finding out that is that way the brain has protected them from remembering. And I think that's where clients coming in, it isn't there to remember, like even a kind of repressed memory stuff. But
Right.
it's more they feel there probably was something, but they can't get to it. And that's the hippocampus.
Right, the hippocampus.
Yeah.
And when trauma often causes us to be in survival mode or in some sort of survival response, so fight, flight, fawn, freeze.
Yes.
And when your brain is in survival mode, the amygdala is the part that's activated, right? And so if your amygdala is overactivated, it's functioning mostly to keep you safe. Your brain isn't able then to consolidate memories. So that is why we hear this from a lot of people of this, I don't remember. It's because your brain didn't have the capacity. And if sleep is impacted, we have to be getting enough sleep to be able to consolidate memories. Like there's lots of things happening internally and in our brains that really impact our brain's ability to remember things. Or yes, how is it our brain causing us to not remember from a place of protection?
I think a key thing, and I share with my clients, is for them to move from, because it's a very frustrating thing to not remember, because it's a very helpless feeling to not remember due to trauma. And I try and do that reframe of, if rather than looking at it that this thing happened to me and I don't remember and I'm frustrated and angry about it, and look at it that your brain and your heart were protecting you. Then there's that piece of that I was being protected, I was being supported, I was being cared for, and therefore, for now, I don't remember.
Right. Yeah. Well
Right
said,
now.
because now we don't know actually what will occur as we, even as you are experiencing sitting doing yoga, what our body opens itself up to.
Right.
And trauma is this really interesting experience where the world speeds up so fast and slows down so completely at the exact same moment. And so even in the midst of a specific trauma, not over the course of years, there might be things that you so acutely remember that the detail of absolutely everything and whole aspects that you cannot access or have no memory of. And the brain is as everyone in this room believes, the brain's fascinating in how it is the fastest slow at the exact same time. It's almost like a screenshot frozen in time that writes on our soul and goes so quickly that we can't hold on or tether to all of the information. And so it makes so much sense to me, thinking even about it that way, that if something was absolutely fast, you're going to miss some details. But we actually don't know, as you just said, what we hung on to in there that we may over time have some access to. I'd love to hear from you all, for our listeners who are sitting there and they're saying, well, maybe I've experienced trauma, but how would I totally know if I was struggling with it? Because not all trauma equals post-traumatic stress disorder. Lots of people experience trauma and maybe don't notice symptoms, but what would you say are signs that someone might see in themselves that note that they could be struggling right now, that might cue them into seeking out some supports?
That's a great question.
I can go into some specific things that we talk about from a PTSD kind of symptom standpoint, if that would be helpful. There are kind of some major categories that we look at. And what I really ask people, I think I mentioned this earlier, is like change in functioning before and after. And I think that you kind of said this, Becky, too, of like, what's the paradigm shift? And how has it changed how you engage in the world, how you feel, what your relationships look like? But there are some kind of major categories. So avoidance. So avoidance would be avoiding anything that reminds you of the traumatic event, forgetting parts of the traumatic event, re-experiencing symptoms, which might be flashbacks, nightmares, intrusive memories, images. Changes in mood, so experiencing, an increase in depression or anxiety, or developing those things if you have never experienced them before. Feelings of guilt and shame. cognitive distortion. So having negative thoughts about yourself or others or the world. So I'm not safe. The world is not safe. People are bad. Those types of things. And then the last category is arousal and reactivity symptoms, which would be that hypervigilance that Amy talked about. Maybe an increase in anger, irritability, sleep disturbances, those types of things.
Yeah.
I think of, and maybe you
And that's not
said-
an exhaustive list. There's obviously
Yeah,
some other
yeah.
things, but
Sure.
And you might have said
Great
this,
list.
but sometimes there's this like just feeling hopeless.
Yep.
Not really know where that fits. If they don't know that it's unprocessed trauma and they're coming in with this feeling of just kind of hopeless. And
Yep.
it looks like depression or
Yeah.
anxiety wrapped in there, but there's just that, like just not being able to see that hope in
Yeah.
the future and diving into that more if there is any
Yeah.
trauma there. The trouble trusting others. I think addiction, that can be a red
Increase
flag.
in substance use or those types of
What's
behaviors.
underneath
Yep.
that? A lot of addiction places now, chemical health programs
Yeah.
really look at trauma because people are coming
Right.
in self-medicating because of that trauma.
Yeah. I just said an increase also in my list that I made, an increase in numbing behaviors. And so I think numbing would be something like substance use, but it could be so many things. It could be gambling, it could be sex, it could be shopping,
Yes.
anything, overeating, anything that is kind of dulling that emotional response system or giving you some dopamine to make you feel a little bit better.
Yeah.
I think one, and you may have mentioned it earlier, I think a huge one is body dysregulation as far as your sensitivity to touch or sound. You could be hypersensitive, or it could be the opposite, a reduced sensitivity to it.
Yeah.
I think is huge, which goes along with anxiety. But also, I think what's so important to remember is what Amanda said, is reflecting on changes from before to after the experience, because you know yourself best. So it's, okay, I'm noticing things about myself, or wow, like, I wasn't like that before.
Yep. I used to hang out with friends,
Yeah.
and I don't anymore.
Yep.
Right.
Or that social anxiety that you've developed. I'll notice with a lot of clients that piece of getting overwhelmed very easily with tasks of, wow, I don't find joy in going in the grocery store anymore. This used to be like my happy place.
Yeah.
Or, things like going to a store and go shopping. Things where if you just make tiny observations, you might think that is so random. But if you put them together,
Yeah. It
it
makes
can
sense.
be as a result of trauma.
Yeah. Well, that makes me think about, you and I did a show several weeks ago about masking. And if I were to say to someone, how might you notice that you are struggling with unprocessed trauma? Do you notice yourself wearing a mask a lot of the time? Does the inside of you, the internal experience that you note, you mentioned it beautifully, Amanda, do you have these images that pop in and you say, where did that come from? Is there a sense of dysregulation? Are you nervous about stuff and the world doesn't know? That to me is a cue of something's happening for you that isn't being shared. And processing can happen all of the ways, but there is a dissonance or an incongruence with what your experience is and how it's being reflected to the world around you. So I love this idea of noting, who was I before this moment? Who was I after? That makes it a little challenging if who was I before was living a life of chronic trauma. As you mentioned earlier, Amy, if this is a routine experience and exposure to. But we can get some information about what brought me joy. What were the things I was doing? Is that different now? And I would say to someone, if you're sitting there listening right now and you notice that masking is a very critical tool, a big part of your day. And when you would say frequency and intensity and duration, yes, yes, yes to all of those, there might be something there.
Well, and if you're someone, a little quick tip for you, if you're going, well, I don't know, like, how am I supposed to know if I'm masking? If you go anywhere, if you work for the day, or you go to the grocery store, or you go to a happy hour or whatever, and you get in the car after it and you go, you were just masking.
Yeah. where you have to kind of release something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Where you're like, okay, I'm done. I survived that.
Kind of like
Not-
an actor on stage in
Yes.
a way. Like you
Yes.
perform.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now I'm done. And I don't mean like I'm tired, long day at work. I
Right.
mean now I can just be myself. That was masking. So it's just like a little moment, like just do a self-check. And if you find yourself doing that, then you were masking.
I completely agree. So if people notice that, now we're all therapists. I would say we have some bias that therapy is a pretty great thing. I'm going to ask you guys to all share, how can people nurture resilience through trauma processing? Because as I heard what you all talked about in being passionate, really it is this companionship that therapy offers in exploration of self, in integration of these traumatic moments. But how can people nurture their resilience?
Self-care. Self-care in all the ways, right? By having a good support system, making sure physically they've got that care. You mean that kind of, how do you build yourself up to be able to do the work?
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the first things I focus on with people, often because people who do have trauma experiences as sleep disturbance, is trying to figure out how they can get better restful sleep, because sleep is such an important part of emotion regulation and being able to show up in the world in a more resourced, what I call resourced way.
Yeah.
So focusing on some of those behavioral things. Are you drinking enough water? What are you eating? Are you eating? So some of those kinds of basic things in terms of helping your body function at the best it can, despite kind of all of these things that are impacting it from an external kind
Yeah,
of
because
standpoint.
you mentioned this earlier in the episode, that if what we say is that trauma impacts our bodies, and you very much believe that, and that is your whole kind of line of work,
Yeah.
that then we kind of need to start there,
Right.
in terms of also nurturing a resilience, that we have to focus on what would the body need, because the body is impacted.
Totally.
I love to hear that. And it's maybe sort of the basic stuff, but it's
It is
things we
basic,
forget
yeah.
a lot.
Totally.
How often we hear from people, no, I don't, I'm not eating.
Yeah.
Or, no, I hardly ever sleep.
Right. And what we want to be able to do, trauma processing, but, also learning coping strategies and engaging in therapy, is we want people to be able to show up not in a survival response. So how do we help people get out of that fight, flight, freeze, fawn kind of response? And, as therapists, we all have kind of our different ways of going about that and strategies. But I think those are some really basic ways. And once you do have those things, once you're addressing those things, it's going to be easier to learn the other skills that a therapist might teach you, or to engage in talking to a therapist about your trauma.
Yeah, totally.
Maybe
well
not
said.
easy, but maybe a little bit less challenging.
Yeah. What would you say, Tara?
I think looking at it from a big picture standpoint, when I looked at the question, when you look at resiliency, I think for the clients that I've worked with, that idea of doing trauma work is so daunting and scary, and it's time intensive, right?
Yeah.
It's not
Yes.
just one session.
Totally.
No,
And
it
what
is
we're asking of our
over the course
clients
of time.
is huge.
It's huge.
So it is that idea of what I'm asking is huge, and it's a lot. But for many, the trauma comes from a very helpless place. And so it's this, by doing the work, it's so empowering, and you are taking the power back. And you are building that resilience. And so it's almost this act of defiance from a place where that trauma sat.
Amy, were you going to say something earlier?
Oh, I was thinking, just what Amanda was saying too, it's complicated though, right? Because if you're coming in, you can't sleep, you've got flashbacks, trauma, triggers, and yet we have to make sure your sleep is okay before we even kind of do, EMDR or some of these other trauma modalities. So it's really kind of trying to do both almost at the same time, but you really have to look at all of it. It's so complicated.
It's very complicated.
Which I also think is a misconception of, we don't ever just meet our client and start with the trauma work. Like, they have to be regulated and in a good place
Ready for the
before.
I think it goes back to what is trauma work? Because I consider all of the
was just gonna say,
and relationship
yes,
building
absolutely.
also to be
Yes.
trauma work. Yeah.
Well said. So much to think about here. This has been a great discussion. We are headed to a commercial break, but when we come back, we're going to talk through listener questions about trauma and how trauma impacts functioning, what we can do about it. Feels Out Loud will process your questions and thoughts in just a moment.
Nobody else. All you got to do now. Nothing to lose. In a world full of strangers, you don't know who to trust.
We are back again with Feels Out Loud, and this part of the show is where we talk through questions from our beautiful listeners. If you have a question related to mental wellness, sharing feelings, or topics for each week that you would like us to process through, please visit our website at becomingtogethermn.com and find the Feels Out Loud page to submit a question directly. Or email us at contact@becomingtogethermn.com. Of course, follow us on social media as well. We really do want to hear from you and what you are wondering about.
And we had several comments and questions this week that really hovered in one category. So I did kind of a mashup of the comments. And we had people really wondering, so this is the question, what are some simple ways that I can manage and cope with my trauma symptoms? And we were just talking about how can I build resilience in our last segment. And so this is kind of a lead-in to actually that question. What are some simple ways that I can manage and cope with trauma symptoms? And Amanda, I'm going to have you start. What would you say?
Well, I think one of the first things that I would encourage people to do, and maybe they're already doing this if they've identified that they have trauma symptoms, but to practice self-compassion and self-validation. One thing that so many
100%.
people in my office say is, well, it wasn't that bad, or other people have experienced worse things than me. And I say, hard stop. This gets to be hard.
Yes.
You are allowed to feel that what happened to you was traumatic and to stop invalidating the fact that it is affecting you or that it's not a big deal, because it is a big deal. And so how can you practice an increased sense of like compassion and validate your own feelings if you don't feel like there have been people in your world who have validated that these things have impacted you in the ways that they have.
Nice.
So that's one of the first things I do. I think also trying to trauma really impacts our sense of safety, both in relationships and the world. So work on finding spaces where you feel safe. So what are relationships that help you feel safe?
Yeah.
Being able to identify either on your own or with a therapist, what does safety feel like in your body? Going back to, I love thinking about how things feel in our body. What is that like for you? Do you feel safe in therapy? What are other spaces maybe in your community where you can have that felt sense of feeling safe and kind of, as I mentioned earlier, being outside of that survival response.
Well said.
Thank you.
What do you say, Tara?
I just think it is so important, as far as what I tell my clients, is to not overexert yourself and to really work on protecting yourself at first. And really going off of what Amanda said is, so what is safe to you and sticking within that. So if that means just going to places that are safe to you or being around the people that are safe to you, it's the safety piece, right? So it's sticking to what is comforting to you and what is safe to you. I think so often it's, well, everything's fine, so I need to stick to my normal schedule.
Yeah.
I need to be social, because what I do is I still need to put everybody else, before me. Mm-hmm. And what is so important in the healing process, particularly with trauma, is, but it's okay to be selfish and also take care of myself first. And so it's just going back to the basics of you need to protect yourself.
Yeah.
And so it is surround yourself with people that are safe, go to places you feel are safe, and comfort yourself.
Yeah.
And start with that.
And I would say, don't underestimate the power of breathing and grounding. That if you notice yourself experiencing whatever trauma symptoms are for you, and that could be a whole gamut of things, note it. That is huge and empowering to note it and take some deep breaths. And if you can, carry something with you. It can be in your pocket, can be in a purse, can be in your car, that grounds you back to the moment. Actually hold that thing if you can have it with you, and remind yourself that your brain might be going somewhere else, your body might be going somewhere else, but you can bring it back into the space that you are in right there. And if it's particularly if it's an object that is safe for you, if it's something you enjoy, that allows you an opportunity to come right back to the moment. And wow, we're at the end of our show already for today. Thank you for listening, everyone, this morning. Join us next week as we continue this discussion on trauma and focus how we process this and all types of different therapeutic modalities. In the week ahead, be kind to yourself. Remember that connection fosters wellness, and your voice is the one the world around you needs to hear, friends. Share yourselves.
Some don't.